Okay, so in this position, we have a knight and a pawn versus 3 pawns if the queens come off the board. So that is interesting. So the question is a knight and a pawn able to win against 3 pawns, or is it a draw? Yeah, so that's what we're going to take a look at here today. Now, here we have Anna Muzychuk with the white pieces versus Abrahamyan Tatev. This was taken from the Fide Women's World Cup 2021. It is black's turn to move, and Abrahamyan Tatev played queen out here to f6. So, was that the very best move, or was that a bad move? And was it better to play queen takes g4? So the interesting thing here is that with the queens on the board, the black king can hardly move. Yeah, the black king essentially has to stay over here with the pawns because the pawns are the protection for the black king. But white has a queen and a knight, and therefore because white has an extra piece, the white king can take more risks and it can move further up the board because it has a knight to help protect it from checks. And so that's the interesting thing here, because the knight is a mobile piece and it can move with the king. You know, the knight can move around and help the king advance up the board, but these pawns over here are pretty much fixed in place. They have to stay on the G and the H file, and they cannot move with the king. So therefore, if the king moves away from the pawns, then the black king doesn't have very much protection at all. And it can come under a lot of attack because white has an extra piece, so black could lose a lot of material there. So therefore, it is very risky for black to move the king with the queens on the board. But it is not risky for white, and that's going to be a deciding factor in this game. So let's go ahead and take a look at what happens if the queens come off the board. And believe it or not, this is actually a draw. I'm going to prove it to you guys. And the reason it's a draw is because since the queens are off the board, the black king is able to become incredibly active and doesn't have to worry about coming under attack. So let's take a look at what happens if Anna Muzychuk were to try and go after this pawn, and then once winning that pawn, try to move the king back over here to stop the h-pawn. Well, if that were to happen, then the black king, as you can see, becomes incredibly active, and all that black has to do is simply trade a pawn for the pawn on f2. And then black is able to draw the game because a knight and a king are not enough to checkmate. Yeah, so that's all that black has to do. And now the white king is trying to get back over here in order to stop these pawns. Well, specifically the pawn on h5. But if white plays king out to d3 now, then it's not in time. Yeah, because the black king was shielding the white king and preventing it from getting over here. So it's going to take too much time, and therefore after king out to d3, h3, and the pawn promotes, it's actually black who's winning here. So therefore, at this point, because of that passed h-pawn, and because of how dangerous it is, white has to bail out with a move like knight to d3, and white has to go after that pawn and stop it. Yeah, so simply knight out to g4, and if the pawn is pushed, then white will take it, and the game is a draw. So, moving the king out here to win this passed pawn, it's not good for white because black has way too much counterplay, and white is just barely in time to draw the game. Yeah, so therefore, it's better if the white king stays over here, so that way it can stop the h-pawn before it even becomes a problem. Well, that means that the white knight has to stop the passed pawn on d5, and this means that that it's going to divide the white's army essentially, and this is going to help black to draw the game. And now white does go after the pawn on h6 and is able to win it, but as you can see, the white king is now too far away from the defense of f2, and the white knight has to stop both the d-pawn and defend f2. It is overloaded, and this is going to give black a much easier time. Yeah, so the knight drops back to e1, which is a good idea, because it guards f3, and this pawn guards those squares, So therefore the black king cannot step forward and win the pawn on f2. And once again, all that white is trying to do is buy enough time to get her king all the way back over here to defend the pawn. And once the white king is able to do that, then she can start pushing the black king back, and can always sack this knight for that pawn, use the king to win this pawn, and then win the game with the passed pawn. So that's the idea, but the black king is not going to allow the white king to get back, and once again the black king is shouldering the white king. So at this point, white is almost in zugzwang. Yeah, because if the pawn moves forward, then the black can simply take it and has at least a draw and may even be winning there. So the pawn can't move, and the king can't move forward, and so therefore either the knight has to move, or the king has to move back to h5. Well, if the king moves back to h5, I mean, that's not good either, because then here comes g3, and black would have at least a draw here. Yeah, if white decides to decline taking that pawn, then black would have two passed pawns, could sacrifice one of them in order to win the pawn on f3, and then the best that white can do here is draw. And the only piece that can stop this passed pawn is the white knight, so white is taking the big risk there. Yeah, that is a pretty big risk. So therefore, king out to h5 is no good. The better move is to play knight to d3. It is a lot safer. And then the king simply drives that knight away and is then able to win this pawn on f2. And once again, if white declines to move the knight, because if the knight moves, then the pawn is captured. But if white decides to simply not move the knight, then white is probably losing here, because black's passed pawn is going to promote, and it will promote faster, and it will do it with checks. So the best that white could do here is to draw the game, and white's not looking to do that. So the interesting thing is that way back here, if the queens come off the board, then essentially the best that white can do is draw. And if white takes a risk and tries to go for something more, then white could risk losing the game. Yeah, so this is actually a draw, which is very interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting because white has a knight and a pawn, but cannot win against three pawns. And this is mainly because, since the queens are off the board, the black king is able to become incredibly active, and all that black has to do is win that pawn on f2, and it's a draw. So that's the plan there. Now, queen f6 is played, and as we can see here, black is going to really struggle to get her king into the game. Yeah, because white has an extra piece, so the black king cannot move very far. Now, it's interesting here because Abrahamyan Tatev moved the king back here to a8, so there is another queen trade, but at this point it's not going to lead to a draw. Yeah, and I'm going to show you guys why. So essentially, because the black king is on g8, because it moved it back a rank, it is one step further away from the center. And this allows white to get her king out here to f5, to the 5th rank. Now, if we head back to what we were looking at here just a few minutes ago, let's see here. Let's head back here. So after king f6, we can see that the white king gets to the 4th rank, and that's as far as it can go. It can't get to the 5th rank, and that is a huge difference here in the endgame. Because in this position, if the queens do come off the board, we can see that the white king gets to the 5th rank, and that would allow her to be able to win these pawns over here on the queen side. Yeah, the black king is too far away. And this now allows white to win the game. Yeah, because black simply doesn't have enough counterplay. The knight stops this pawn, and the white king could look to win this pawn, then push this guy up the board, something like that. Or the white king could simply swing around, win this pawn, and then head back over here in order to help promote this pawn after winning this one on g7. So essentially 2 pawns versus a knight and 1 pawn are not good enough, and that's very interesting. So black would have to have 3 pawns versus a knight and pawn in order to be able to draw the game. And then the position of the king is very important too, because here we have, the knight and pawn versus 3 pawns, we have that. But the white king is 1 rank further up the board. It's much more active. And that becomes the deciding factor. Yeah, because essentially here black has to either defend this pawn or this pawn, and the black king can't do everything. Yeah, it can't do everything. So, Alrighty, so let's head back and let's take a look. So after queen to e5, black decides not to trade off the queens here, but instead moves the king up the board, because now if white trades off the queens, then black can move the king further, and once again we have a position where the white king cannot reach the 5th rank. So that is the key here. So therefore white declines to trade off the queens, and we can see that the black king has no choice but to retreat behind these pawns, because if the black king were to try to remain active and move out to a square such as this, then we can see that white can bring the knight in, and the black king just doesn't have as much shelter, and white would be winning there. So therefore the king must move to an area where it is protected. But we can see that white's protection comes not from pawns, but from the knight. So white is able to use the knight to help assist her king in moving up the board. And we can see that the white king is gradually becoming more active. It has help from both the knight and the queen, but it is now incredibly active and is able to help win the pawn on d5. And once that pawn on d5 is captured, then white is suddenly winning the game. And that's the difference. So with the queens on the board, because white has an extra piece, the knight on d4, it is winning, because the white king can be more active and doesn't have to worry about losing material because of checks or being checkmated. So that's the difference. The difference is that with the queens on the board, the white king is able to become much more active than black's king. So the white king is essentially it's like having another piece, because the black king isn't able to do much, and the white king can do all kinds of stuff. So that's the difference there. And that is why white is winning. And so a few more moves are played, then the queens come off the board, and now we can see that the black king is able to become more active with the queens off the board. But unfortunately, because black is down one of her pawns, the game is completely lost for black. Yeah, there is really no counterplay, and here after knight takes g4, we can see that Tatev resigned. But Tatev is a very good chess player, extremely good, top player for the U.S. women's team, and she will hopefully come back and win tomorrow. But we'll see. She is playing a very, very tough opponent, and this is just how the game could have continued, and this is how white would have won that endgame, by promoting the pawn in such a fashion. But anyway, so thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you all next time.